Today we're going to be installing a pair of double adjustable QA1 shocks in my 1972 Dodge Challenger. Now these shocks are very useful in a Mopar specifically, simply because the stock rear suspension is very squishy, and when you go through dips and bumps and around corners, the car likes to squat, it likes to squish, and sometimes you even rub the belly of the car on the ground. So if you have any kind of weight in the back, or if you do a little bit of racing, the double adjustable shocks or even their single adjustable shocks seem to make a really big difference. This is, I think, the third car that I install these on, and every single time so far it's made a big difference. So I can't wait to get these installed on the Challenger, and it only takes a couple of steps. So inside the box you have a quick set of instructions, a sticker, a lifetime warranty card, a couple of spacers and washers, and of course the shock absorber itself. Looking at the shock absorber, you're going to see that this one has two eyelids, a big one on the bottom and a big one on top. If we take a look at the factory shock absorber, you'll see that it has a big eyelid on the bottom, not as big as the QA1 one, but pretty decent, and then it's got a small eyelid on top, which means that we're going to need to make these holes smaller, and that's where these spacer bushing adapters come in. If we look at these bushings individually, you'll see that they have different thicknesses depending on what hardware is going to be used on this car. So I mentioned that the bottom hole was a little bit smaller than the one on the QA1 shock, so we're going to want to grab the thinnest wall bushing and slip that one into the bottom of the shock. Now for the top one, we know that it uses a 1/2 inch size bolt because this one slips right in with almost no play, and since we know that the factory ones on the QA1 shock are way too big, the only thing we have to do now is match up the bolt to the bushing, which is actually the one with the smallest hole, and that one seems to fit really well. So that's going to be the first step. We're going to install the thickest bushing on top and the thinnest bushing on the bottom. These sleeves actually have to get pressed onto the shock bushing, and the best way to do this for me has been to use a vise or a press, and even a 3-inch seat clamp seems to do the trick very well. The only thing that I would say is to add a little bit of lube to the bushing before sliding in the sleeves, and then you should be able to have these guys slip right in. So here we go with the top bushing. And now we just need to do the bottom one. Now that we've got the new sleeves in here, it's time to remove the old shock absorbers. On the Challenger specifically, there is an access hole here on the back, and then you're going to have somebody help you and grab the nut that's on the opposite side underneath. Working together, you guys can get the bolt out. Once you slide that bolt out, the shock absorber should be able to be pulled down. On some cars, you actually don't have the upper access point, and you have to do everything from the bottom. Since I'm by myself, I'm going to have to do everything from the bottom anyway. As for the bottom mount, all you have to do is take off the nut, the washer, and then slip this guy out. After you slip this guy out, since we already took off the top bolt, we can just pull the shock absorber down and move on to the next step. The new shock absorbers are actually oil filled, so there is no rebound. They don't pop up by themselves. Once you get it installed, fully compressed, you can go ahead and pull it out yourself, and that's what we call extension. So the new one just kind of pops right into place. Make sure that the adjusters are facing inward so you can actually reach them. Then all you have to do is slide it into place and fit the nut and washer back on here. On this car, they are 3/4 or 19 millimeters. Some other cars may have a different size nut, so make sure you check that. Another note is that make sure that the washer is caved toward the shock and not away from the shock. And all that does is that it helps cup the bushing, keeps everything together a little bit better. Since there's no rebound, what's nice about these shocks is that you can push these up or down and they'll stay wherever you decide to put them. One drawback of the shocks, however, is that now you're going to have a gap between the shock crossmember and the shock absorber itself. But luckily there's a solution inside of the box. So earlier I mentioned that along with the sleeves, it also came with a couple of washers. These are actually misalignment spacers, and believe it or not, these are actually really close to the final size that you need underneath your car. So this is a stock shock, but you guys can get a general idea. This is what it looks like inside the car, and there's a gap between here and the body. So with the shock underneath, you slip the bolt in from one side, holding it in place. So to demonstrate, I'm going to use the stock shock. Basically, you just run the bolt in through the body, through the shock, and then you let it hang at the very end right here. Then you go ahead and grab the misalignment spacer and shim it on up there, and then you kind of just push the bolt through, and then this will go through the body, and then you'll have this much sticking out on the opposite end. It's a little bit tricky to get this done, and there's not really a better way to do it, but a little bit of masking tape before you slip this onto the car might also work. Alright, so we got both shock absorbers bolted back here, and I left the adjusters facing down toward the ground. I might change that later on. It just depends on whether or not this becomes a danger zone for running things over. If I were to flip it around, what I was worried about was hitting the leaf springs, and so it's a kind of a give or take situation, ease of access versus security and not being able to reach it. The adjusters go from 1 to 20, so once you get close to 20, the knob gets very stiff, and so if you're fighting the close area up here, it gets extremely difficult to make the adjustments. And I've driven it already a few times, and let me tell you that the adjustments make a huge difference. I went from basically 0 adjustment to a 4, and it completely stopped the rear end from squatting, from putting a little bit of weight in the back. And then I went from 4 to 10, and it made driving my dirt road completely impossible. I can't imagine what the setting is going to be like when we switch all 4 corners to 20 and then switch it all the way back down to 0 to see what the difference is. But we will find that out in the next video. This video was just to install these guys, set the preliminary adjustments, and now that we're here, it's time to get this guy on the road and see what the difference is between maximum and minimum adjustments, both on the street and then on the track. So that'll be in the next video. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher signing out.